Yo, this is G, and this is the video for graphing HK form. If you have not watched the video for converting a slope-intercept form or slope-intercept form, please go back and do so before you watch this one. So, you guys, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at equations that are not in slope-intercept form and actually learn a different way to graph them. Because sometimes we just don't need to convert to slope-intercept form if we don't want to and if we don't have to. The reason why this works out for us sometimes is because our y-intercept might be, maybe it's like a fraction, and so we won't have a very accurate graph, and it makes it very difficult. Okay, so this is when it makes it a little bit easier to graph, and we'll look at examples of that. So like, for example, this equation right here, y equals 2 times x minus 1 plus 3. Again, it's a linear equation. I have a y and my x, okay? And there's no exponents. So I know this is going to be, when I graph this, it's definitely going to give me a line. And so I can graph this. I could convert this to slope-intercept form. So I could multiply and use distributive property first and get y equals 2x minus 2 plus 3, negative 2 plus 3 is positive 1. I could just do that, and now I could graph from here. Okay, it won't always work out this easy, though, especially when I have a fraction in the front as my slope. Okay, so say this was like 3 over 2. Now it's not going to be so friendly because then I would have my y-intercept would be a fraction, and that's a little bit difficult to graph. Okay, but that's one way to graph this. But there's also another way, and it's called HK form. So here's what HK form is. HK form is y equals m, my slope, times, and then I have parentheses here, x minus h plus k. The h is the x value, okay, and the k is the y value. Okay, so what we're doing is we're just taking a point from the line, okay, taking any point from the line. It's not necessarily the y-intercept, it's not an x-intercept, it's just a point that's on the line. We're plugging it, and it comes, and it's in this form. It's being replaced by h and k here. Okay, so the h is the x value, the k is the y value, and this would work every single time. Okay, and so what we would do is we would just graph the point that we can take out from this format. We would graph the point, and then we would use our slope from that point. So instead of graphing the y-intercept, we're just graphing any point, the point that's given, and then we use our slope from there instead of using our slope from the y-intercept. Okay, the reason why we need to know HK format, because again, I know some people might ask, why don't we just convert to slope-intercept form? It's way easier. The biggest reason why is because when we get to future different types of functions like absolute value functions, exponential functions, quadratic functions, we always graph them from HK form. Okay, we always graph from HK, so it's nice to see it now because it's going to make life a lot easier in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at this format right here. So we know we have our slope, we have the x value, we have the y value. And let's take a look at the previous example that we had from the first slide. So here's HK form. Okay. Now I have my first example. So what I want to do is I want to pull the point out of here, start from there, and then just use my slope. So I know right away, here's my slope. I'm going to put it over 1 right now because I need my rise and my run. And now I need to pull out my point that I want to graph. Okay, this is the kind of the tricky part. So the y is the easy part because you know how this is a positive k here. So whatever, if this is positive, then it's just going to be positive 3. If this was negative minus 3, it would just be negative 3. Okay. So that's the easy part. The x point is a little bit tricky because it's always going to be the opposite of what's inside what's here. So because this is minus h, okay, because this is, h is already actually a negative, that means it's going to be the opposite sign of what's in here. Okay, so for example, because this is minus 1, well, that would be minus whatever my h is. So because this is negative 1 inside my parentheses, my x point value is actually a positive 1. Okay, and the reason why, if I have x minus h right here, and I'm replacing this h with a 1, I'm actually replacing this h with a positive 1, aren't I? Because this x minus is still here. Okay, the x minus is still here, and then I'm just replacing with whatever h is. Well, h is positive 1, so that's why I have x minus 1. Okay, which means my x is a positive 1. That's what I substituted in here. Okay, if it was negative, for example, and I have x minus h, and I wanted to plug in a negative value there, if I had x minus, let's say, -1, this double negative makes it a positive, making it x plus 1. But really, the value I plugged in was a negative, so that's why it's always going to be the opposite. It's a little confusing at first, but it just takes a little time to get used to. Okay, so now that I have this point, I pulled out my point. I got the positive 1 from my h right, my negative h right here, and then I got the 3 from my k. So I can plot that point, 1, 1, 2, 3. So there's the point I start from instead of my y-intercept. And now I just graph my slope from this point. I just use my slope. My rise is 2. My run is 1. 1, 2 over 1. 1, 2 over 1. Okay, I can go up again if I wanted to. And there's my line. All right, so let's look at another example though. Okay, now this is an example that's definitely makes it more friendly because now I'm not going to have to worry about a decimal or a fraction as my y-intercept. If I converted this to slope-intercept form, I would have a decimal or fraction, so I'm always going to be I'm never going to be dealing with perfect points when I use my slope. And so it's going to be nice just to pull the point from here, pull the point out of my HK form, and then use my slope from there because then I'm dealing with perfect points and not fractions. Okay, so we'll have definitely a more accurate graph. So first I need to figure out what is my point. Okay, so if we look on the outside here, here's my k. It's always going to be on the outside of the parentheses. So this is my y value. And I just copy down what the number is. Because it's -2, my y value is -2. Now I need to look at and see what my x value is. So again, because it was x minus h inside those parentheses, I need to take whatever the opposite is here for my x value. So because this is +3, my h is actually going to be -3. And the reason why is if I plugged into my original HK format, x minus h, if I were to plug in x minus -3, negative plus a negative actually becomes positive, so I'll get this value right here. So here's my starting point, so I'm just going to plot that real quick. -3, 1, 2, 3, -2, 1, 2. Okay, so there's my starting point that I pulled from this equation. Now I get to use my slope. My slope is -1/2. Okay, so now I just graph my slope from here. Because my slope is negative, I'm going to go down 1 and over 2 instead of up 1 over 2. So I get to go down 1 over 2. And notice how this makes a negative slope or I can go up 1, but if I go up 1, I have to go to the left 2, positive and then negative. Okay, and notice how this makes a negative slope from left to right. If I'm reading this from left to right, it is going down. From left to right, this line is going down. It is not going up. Okay, so this is a negative slope. So this would be the graph of this line. And again, the y-intercept here is not a perfect point. So the y-intercept right here is not a perfect point. It's going through 3.5 right here, -3.5, which is the reason why we wanted to make sure why this graph method is a little bit easier, especially when you get to more complicated fractions. So I got another one. Okay, so now this one, I got this value over here instead of on the other side. My k has kind of been moved around. Okay, so what we can do is we can just put it into HK format. Okay, so if I know my HK, I know I'm pretty close because looks like I have a slope. I've got my x value right here. I'm just looking for this k right here. So what I would do is I just want to move this to this side. And I can do that just like I would solve an equation by subtracting 3 because that cancels. I've now got y by itself. I've got recopy down to everything else. And then I'm just subtracting 3 from all that. Okay, so now I've got my HK format. I want to pull out my slope and I want to pull out my point. Okay, so that's my HK point. Okay, so my slope is 3 over 2. There's my rise and my run. That was kind of easy. It's right here. My point, let's see. So because this is a -3, I know my y value is just -3. I'm just going to pull that down. And this is -2, so I need to take the opposite, which is +2. So +2, -3. There's my starting point. And again, had I converted this to slope-intercept form, I'm going to have a fraction for a y-intercept, so it's going to get a little complicated. Now I can use my slope, though, of rise over run from this point. So my rise is 3, my run is 2. So 1, 2, 3 over 2. 1, 2, 3 over 2. I could also go down 1, 2, 3 over 2. Oh, this y-intercept actually worked out nicely. That's lucky. Okay, and there's my graph. Okay, last one. This one's just going to look a little bit different. So now it looks like I'm in HK. I'm started sort of in HK form, but I don't have anything here, and I don't have anything on the other side of the y. Okay, it's y equals, and I've got my slope here. Okay, my slope here is negative 1/3. Okay, but I don't have a k value. I only have an h value. Well, this is the same thing as the same plus 0. Okay, this is the same thing as my y is just 0. So my hk point, my starting point, because there's nothing there, my starting point is at 0. Okay, and now I can pull my x value from within my parentheses. Because it's plus 1, I'm going to take the opposite, which is minus 1. So there's my starting point is negative 1, 0. Okay, and now again, I can just calculate my slope from here. I mean, I can use my slope to graph my line. It is a negative slope, so I need to be going down from left to right. So negative 1 over 3, so negative 1 over 3. Negative 1 over 3. I could go positive 1 to negative 3. That would still give me a negative slope. Okay, and there we have it, folks. Okay, and that's it. So biggest thing with HK format, and probably the most confusing part, is this x point right here, is pulling this value out and making sure it's always the opposite. Okay, so the x value is always the opposite. And that's just really important to remember, because if we were to put positive 1 here, our graph would be shifted over a couple, and that's not what we want. Okay, so be careful about that. The slope works the exact same as it has in the past, so that doesn't change. The only thing is that we're just pulling a point from this format. Okay, if you guys have any questions, let me know, and good luck.